Hurricane Matthew watch continues, friends. The storm has, for now, stayed far enough offshore to spare Central Florida the direct hit that many had feared, but it is not over yet. The city of Jacksonville, Florida, as well as areas in Georgia and South Carolina, are still on high alert, and we'll be tracking that throughout the show. Meanwhile, just 48 hours before the second presidential debate, Donald Trump is in double trouble for a pair of controversial utterances that are burning up the wires at this hour. One took place at an immigration roundtable at Trump Tower today, and we'll talk about that in a moment. The other was into a hot mic more than 10 years ago, but boy, is it a scorcher. A video obtained by the Washington Post features audio of Trump in 2005 making comments that the words lewd and vulgar are mild descriptions for, about trying to sleep with a married woman. At the time, Trump himself was married to his third wife, Melania, and he was talking to Billy Bush from Access Hollywood as they were arriving on the set of Days of Our Lives to tape a segment. Donnie, people have... this video is out. We're going to play some of it momentarily, but almost everybody watching this show will have already seen it. So I want to ask you this. Trump was going to get asked about bad language, bad attitudes towards women already. This is going to be a big topic in the debate on Sunday for sure, given the way the first debate went, Alicia Machado, all of that. How much worse do you think this makes it, and what can Trump do now, given the depth of the hole he's dug himself in?
Let the record show at 4:01 p.m. On October 7th, this election ended. When this Washington Post story broke, this is so lewd. And I actually, yesterday morning, it said on Morning Joe, you watch in the next week, once a week, there will be stuff with women coming out. Because this man has lived this way for 30 or 40 years. Hillary Clinton's been vetted. This is his first go-around, and they've been saving the best for last. This is going to be so offensive to women. It's not just he's talking about sleeping with a woman he's married, and we're going to play this in a couple of seconds. It's the lewdness. It's the misogynistic nature. It's the aggressive, demeaning nature of women. You do not recover from this. This election ended. All they can say is, I am sorry, and the scary thing, there will be more to come.
There's the Trump campaign put out a statement. I want to read that statement. I want to get the statement up here. Again, we're going to play this in a second, but this is the Trump campaign statement about this video that we're going to show you in a second. They said, this was locker room banter, a private conversation that took place many years ago. Bill Clinton has said far worse to me on the golf course, not even close. I apologize if anyone was offended. So I'll say, I said yesterday on this show that I thought, before this had happened, that the only recourse Trump would have, given the things he has said about women, including Alicia Machado, the only recourse he had was to apologize in a forthright way. We're now going to play the video, but I will say for now, just at the outset, before we watch the video, saying I apologize if anybody was offended is not an apology. And the necessity of Trump to apologize, if he wants to have any chance of saying, it may not. Yeah. But the only recourse he has now, the only recourse, is an abject apology to the women of America. Take a look at this, watch the video now, and see if you agree with me.
I moved on her, actually. You know, she was down in Palm Beach. I moved on her, and I failed. I'll admit it.
Whoa.
I did try and her. She was married.
It's huge news there.
No, Nancy,
yeah.
And I moved on her very heavily. In fact, I took her out furniture shopping. She wanted to get some furniture. I said, I'll show you where they have some nice furniture. I took her out furniture. I moved on her like a but I couldn't get there. And she was married. And all of a sudden, I see her. She's now got the big phony and everything. She's totally changed her look. I better use some Tic Tacs just in case I start kissing her. You know, I'm automatically attracted to beautiful. I just start kissing them. It's like a magnet. You just kiss. I don't even wait. And when you're a star, they let you do it. You can do anything.
Whatever you want.
Grab them by the. Hello, how are you? Hi.
Trump, how
nice
are you?
Seeing you. Terrific.
Pleasure to meet you.
Terrific. You know Billy Bush?
How are you?
Nice to see you. How you doing, Ariane?
I'm doing very well, thank you. Are you ready to be a soap star?
We're ready. Let's go. Make me a soap star.
How about a little hug for the Donald? He just got off the bus.
Like a little hug,
Okay,
darling?
absolutely. Melania said this was okay.
I just got off the bus.
Bushy.
There we go. Excellent. Well, you've got a nice co-star here.
Good.
Yes, absolutely.
After you. Come on, Billy. Don't be shy.
As soon as a beautiful woman shows up, he takes
Get over
off
here,
on
Billy.
this. Always happens.
So everything about that is gross, right? I mean, just gross, gross, gross. And of course, I mean, yes, of course, it is locker room banter, and there are many men who have engaged in such locker room banter, but this is a guy with a huge pre-existing problem.
Yeah.
Again, I'm not saying, we know people, maybe even you and I, on some occasions have said things that are vulgar and lewd.
Which is one of the reasons I'm not running for office.
But we're not running for president, and on top of that, we haven't publicly fat-shamed people. Yes. We haven't publicly called people pigs and dogs and slobs. We don't have a history of that kind of crudeness towards more than 50% of the American population. This is a huge. It's like the worst things that happen in politics to any candidate is when a pre-existing narrative that you have created yourself to some extent and your opponents have helped to foster, when that gets illustrated in the most vivid way possible. This is an existing problem for Trump that is now going nuclear.
In the '92 Clinton election, you had a big poster on the wall in the war room. It's the economy stupid.
Right.
It's the women stupid.
Right.
And women, any woman, just like I think now this is going to galvanize women to come out and vote, just like Barack Obama, every African American who in any way was ever kept down, offended, had anything happen to them in life with just almost anybody about their race. This now for women, for any woman that was harassed in the workplace, that felt, objectified by men, there's a anger towards women about this. There is a level of disdain of women.
Pause for a moment. I want to read. We have a Clinton statement. We don't have. There's a Clinton tweet from Hillary Clinton or from the campaign. Tell me, people. Which is it? No? From Hillary Clinton herself. Hillary Clinton has tweeted, maybe under her name and under her staff's name, calling this a horrific comment. So they are already starting to capitalize on that.
It is, and I think when there were some things that were bleeped out, it shows a disdain for women. It's not just, hey, she's hot, and women are going to come out in droves, and they're going to speak, and that's what the election ended today. And by the way, there'll be 4 more in the next 4 weeks.
I said before that I thought that Trump needed to apologize. I think I want to say it this way. I think you may be right. Maybe. I don't know. It's still a lot of days to election day and a lot of things to happen. But I think for Donald, for the sake of forgetting about winning the election, Donald Trump needs to apologize at this point in order to save, if he wants to retain any semblance of his dignity, and some people say he has no dignity anymore anyway, but if he wants to have any semblance of it, he's going to need to do a lot more than he did in that statement, not really apologizing for this really disgusting piece.
You and I are communication guys. How do you apologize? It's who he is.
I know.
He's shown it.
I know. He doesn't like to apologize. Clinton calls it horrific.
I think we're going to watch the wheels come off now. Okay, in less of Trump news this morning, at Trump Tower, the Republican nominee was holding a roundtable with leaders of a border control union when one of those labor officials from Arizona reportedly claimed that immigration agents were not deporting people who are in this country illegally so those immigrants can vote in the election. According to a pool report, Trump repeated the allegations, stating, quote, "They're letting people pour into the country so they can go and vote." This has been an election filled with conspiracy theories, and here's another one that fits perfectly into Trump's basic thesis that this election is rigged. Just last weekend, Trump urged his supporters to monitor some polling places for voting fraud. Okay, John, if Trump loses the election, how much of these arguments are going to play into that? How much of an effect do they have?
Well, I think one of the most kind of disgraceful things about that has been true of Trump, and we just played something that's disgraceful in a different way. But in terms of having a respect for democratic institutions in this country and for taking seriously what the responsibilities are if you're the nominee of a major party, the notion that he has suggested for months now that somehow the election was rigged and that somehow if he lost it would be because of vote theft or somehow the corruption, telling people, hey, we can't lose Pennsylvania unless it's stolen from us. All of that, I think, shows an incredible disrespect and disregard for what, as I say, the responsibilities of being the nominee are. Your job as the nominee is to fight as hard as you can, and then when you lose, to ensure the peaceful process, transfer of power over to the next person who's president of the United States. I think Trump will try to undermine that. I think this is yet another sign that he's going to go way further, and it's going to be really bad.
Trump, beyond anything, is a marketer, and he has a target audience of 40 million uneducated, disenfranchised white Americans. His first strategy to sell them is to sell them on a presidency. His backup strategy is to sell them on a revolution. That basically coming out of this election, everything was rigged. They're still out to get you, which sets him up. We've talked about this for the Trump political party, the Trump network. He all along has been hedging that even if he loses, he's going to stay connected to this audience, not in the form of a president, but in the form of a revolutionary leader. It doesn't matter whether he loses big or not. He is setting himself up. In the next 4 weeks, you're going to see this ratchet.
I will say, to be clear, Trump was picking up on something that someone else said at this roundtable, but he seized on it in an aggressive way. And I will say to both of them, the person who first said it and to Donald Trump, the idea that the Border Patrol is being told to let illegal immigrants rush into the country in order so they can vote for Hillary Clinton,
which they won't be able to vote,
is insane. Last night, Donald Trump held a town hall in New Hampshire. At first glance, it seemed like it was going to be a practice round for his big debate against Hillary Clinton on Sunday night. Everyone was watching closely to see if we would see clues of a different Trump, one who interacts compassionately with the audience and shows more message discipline. So here is how Trump did.
Back from Las Vegas, where we gave a tremendous, we had a tremendous crowd of people. A lot of Hispanics, Latinos, they like to be called in that area. You know that, right? Hispanics and Latinos.
Karen Whitaker from Sandown, here in Sandown. Karen.
Hi, Karen. Oh, thank you, thank you. I like this audience. I like this audience. Bernie Sanders would have been legendary if he didn't make a deal with the devil. When he made that deal, his stock went way down. John Harwood was the worst moderator out of all the debates we had. You know, they use John King, actually. He's a nice guy. I like him on the maps. I used to say, I think someday he'll be an anchor. Guess what? He's still doing the maps. Do you really think that Hillary Clinton is debate prepping for 3 or 4 days? Hillary Clinton is resting, okay? She's resting. She wants to build up her energy for Sunday night. And you know what? That's fine.
Okay.
Let's have a fun question.
What is one of your earliest memories as a child, and why do you think it stands out? And then she says, go Donald.
Thank you. Thank you. The most successful people I've ever met are the people that never quit. They never give up. They just don't take no for an answer. So do something that you really love doing, because then it's not work. And never, ever quit or give up.
So Trump said that the event last night in New Hampshire was not a dress rehearsal for the Washington University debate this weekend in St. Louis. But Donnie, if Trump shows up that way on Sunday and repeats this performance, do you think that will be enough to put him in a position to maybe win the debate? In the context of what we've been talking about earlier in the show, it seems like your answer might be no.
Well, even without that way, people said that was softballs. That was more T-ball. I mean, questions like, what are you going to say to Hispanics who've been deceived by Obama and Clinton and the biased media to get them to vote for you? Right. I don't think he's going to get questions like that. If anything, I think this hurts him, because obviously it was a set-up audience. There was nothing about the logistics that has to happen in a town hall of him walking around. So if he in any way, shape, or form thinks this prepared him, that actually set him backwards. I actually think we're going to see a disaster from him, because what he has never faced in a town hall before is a Latino person or a Muslim or an overweight person face-to-face asking about these allegations. Hillary Clinton's kind of negatives, there's nobody's going to stand up and say, I represent emails for this country, or I represent the Clinton Foundation. He's going to come face-to-face with his sins, and he's going to unwind them.
I think that, you look at the way he performed, he barely interacted with anybody in the audience. He was calmer. He was in a friendly crowd. He was calmer. But beyond being calmer, he didn't really interact with anybody in the audience, and he still was launching all kinds of crazy attacks on the Commission on
John Harwood.
And John Harwood and moderators. If this is the way that Trump's going to go, he's going to be up there on stage. I don't want to make a prediction about this, but he's got 2 moderators up there. He's got Martha Raddatz and he's got Anderson Cooper. He believes that Anderson Cooper is a member of the Clinton News Network.
Yes.
And so he's going to come in with a chip on his shoulder about Anderson to begin with. I do not disallow the possibility that Trump is going to try to take on Anderson in the middle of the debate. And if he gets in a fight with someone in the audience, if he gets in a fight with the moderators, if he starts saying the stuff he's saying, and then if he ignores the audience, as he basically did last night, beyond the larger issues he's facing right now, this debate is not going to go well for Donald Trump.
What are we going to do November 8th? What are we going to have to talk about after that?
We'll have a beer.
This show is ending soon.
All right, read the prompter again, Donnie. Go ahead.
Coming up, Reverend Al Sharpton joins us. Talk about yet another controversial Donald Trump things this week. This doesn't stop. We will be right back.
The gruesome story of a 1989 rape case has made its way back into the headlines because of what Donald Trump said about the attack yesterday. For those of you who don't remember, the Central Park jogger case involved a group of 5 teenage boys accused of sexually assaulting and bludgeoning a 28-year-old woman who survived. During the trial, which attracted national media attention, those 5 boys said they were coerced into confessions after days of interrogation, but they were still found guilty. In 2002, a convicted rapist and murderer confessed that he had committed the crime, and his DNA matched the DNA found at the scene. All 5 of the original convicts were exonerated, and in 2014, New York City paid them a $41 million settlement. As a private citizen, Donald Trump was outspoken about this case, saying he thought the so-called Central Park 5 were guilty. And yesterday, in a story published by CNN, the now Republican nominee repeated his belief by saying, quote, "They admitted they were guilty. The police doing the original investigation say they were guilty. The fact that the case was settled with so much evidence against them is outrageous." Joining us now to talk about all of this is someone who played a public role in that case, Reverend Al Sharpton, civil rights leader and president of the National Action Network, and of course, host of MSNBC's Politics Nation. Rev, good to see you.
Good to see you.
Just right off the bat here, your reaction to Donald Trump still sticking with the notion that the Central Park 5 were guilty is what?
I mean, if he wanted to say that I believed it at that time, that's one thing. To say now, after DNA established, DNA, we're talking about scientific evidence, that someone that confessed to it in jail was in fact the one that did it, and to say that it was outrageous and the evidence was against them, when the scientific evidence is what vindicated them, to me shows that this is the level of a man that can never, ever possibly say he's wrong.
So what is that? But what is that? What is it about in your view? I mean, this is you just laid out a case where no rational person, unless they had malign motives, would go where he's going. So what's your interpretation of what he is trying to do here politically?
Well, I think politically he's playing to people that he feels have certain biases and certain leanings in this country. Some racial, some just based on their anti-whatever's going on. And he's trying to play to that crowd that I'll never step down, even in the face of DNA evidence. I stood with these 5 young men when they were first charged, and they said they were coerced. One of them, when he finally got out of jail, one did 15 years and had to come work at National Action Network, even after he was vindicated, because he did 15 years of the best years of his life. And for this young man to see now that after all of this, Donald Trump is saying that the evidence was against them and it's outrageous to think that they would get a settlement. Who is he playing to here? It shows, one, that he will play to any kind of bias, and second, that he absolutely does not have the capacity to apologize or say that he's wrong. I mean,
it's interesting.
You're dealing with even these tapes that you started the show with. He can't even apologize for his own voice. You're going to put this man in the White House, and he can't deal with his own voice.
There are 2 things. Mike Barnicle said this best once, that there's no capacity for empathy. Here are men that serve chunks of their life. DNA, there's a 1 in 4 billion chance it's wrong. I want to ask you and I have been around this town a long time. We both know Donald a long time. I never thought the guy was a racist. I mean, I don't know him intimately, but I never heard anything. And how do you, as somebody who's known him, as somebody who is, if not one of the leaders, one of the great leaders of the African-American community, how can you look at him any other way but a racist at this point? How do we get him off the hook and say, well, is there any other way to slice and dice it at this point?
You know, about 2 years ago on Politics Nation, I kept hitting him on the racial implications of the birth issue, which he was championing. And he and I talked, because I didn't agree, disagreed. I marched on him and have disagreed with him. But he and I talked. I sat down and met with him. And I told him, he says, you can't call me a racist. I said, but the birtherism is rooted in racism. And he argued about it. Now, what he's done from birth on is even worse, Donnie, than racism, because he's playing to what he knows is racism. So if he's not a real racist, it's even worse that you're going to fan racism. So whether he sits around at night saying, I hate blacks, or I hate Mexicans, I don't know. It's worse than that if you're flaying what you know is racial animus. I couldn't think of anything lower than that.
It's been so surprising to me that he come back. Just the other day, he was talking about how, under Hillary Clinton, we see it now, under Hillary Clinton, Barack Obama, we now see race riots on a regular basis in our cities. There's so much of it. I know there's the personal thing of, who is this man in his heart, but I find it hard to come up with an alternative explanation other than that he is trafficking in racist tropes at a very minimum.
At
by
a
the
very
way,
minimum. And for him, if in his heart he doesn't believe it, it makes you even a worse character to do something. What kind of person wouldn't believe it and could do these?
But at the end of the day,
things?
that makes him a racist, even if he doesn't believe it, because he's still using race.
Gentlemen, we got to get out. Reverend Al Sharpton, thank you for coming by to
Have a
talk
good
about
week.
do a little review of history
Pray
here.
for those down in the hurricane.
You can pray for them for sure, and also catch the Reverend's show, Politics Nation, on MSNBC on Sunday mornings at 8 a.m. if you're up that early. Coming up, we will talk about ads after these ads.
Now for a favorite topic of mine, campaign advertising. We're joined by someone who is equally obsessed. I think he's more obsessed with the topic. Ken Goldstein of Bloomberg Politics Polling, an ad analyst. He's in San Francisco now. Ken, there's some breaking news today on Trump ad spending, talk of him cutting back. What are you hearing and from where?
So it seems that Donald Trump is cutting back on his spending in Florida, in Iowa, in North Carolina, and in Ohio. Listen, usually, and it is a sad time for people like you and me who are obsessed with ads because, listen, we talk about ads, we think ads matter, but we think ads matter at the margin. You and John have just had a whole discussion about Donald Trump's recent comments, and that's about not things mattering at the margin. That's about things mattering in a massive, massive way. So it suggests a little bit of re-strategizing, if that's a word, by Trump in terms of which states he's looking at. But all of that is just going to get washed away, sorry to use that analogy now, with the news that just broke here in this last hour, hour and a half that you were discussing.
So, Ken, one of the things that you're always focused on, and one of the things you've sort of taught me, is that, you know, you can look, we're all obsessed with polls, but forgetting about the content of ads, if we watch the pattern of spending and where ads are being placed and where they're being pulled, it tells you a lot, in some ways, more about the campaign than the polls do in some respects. Just talk about what the picture is now if you look at the pattern of ad spending and some of the new ways you have of kind of thinking about how to quantify that.
Sure, and this is all analysis that I did an hour and a half ago, right before the world changed on us. But advertising is reality. You can say you're contesting a state, you can say a state is competitive, but the bottom line, still in this, in a new world of digital and internet, if you're not spending ad dollars in a state, you're not serious. And so what we see where the Hillary Clinton campaign is serious. They're serious in Florida. They're serious in Nevada. They are spending money in Pennsylvania. So it's not just this, fantasy discussion about whether Pennsylvania could possibly be in play. Listen, frankly, like many things in the Trump campaign, usually I would say I don't need to be inside the war room because I can see what the ads are saying. I'm not even sure the Trump team has a war room or they're making these data-driven decisions. But when it comes to the Clinton campaign, they're serious about Florida, they're serious about Pennsylvania, they're serious about Ohio, they're serious about Nevada. Colorado and Virginia, they think are in the bag.
So, Ken, really quick, with the Trump campaign pulling ads from where they say they're pulling ads, does that say to you they're giving up on those states? And how could that possibly make sense, if true?
Okay, so now you're asking me to make sense of Trump campaign decisions. Listen, if I was trying to make sense of decisions, what the thinking would be North Carolina, Ohio, they have to win those anyways. Pennsylvania is the pivot point. That's maybe where ads matter at the margin.
Right.
But this does not look like this is going to be at the margin.
Wow. All right. Ken Goldstein, thank you. We will strategize with some strategists when we come back right after this.
I moved on her, actually. You know, she was down in Palm Beach. I moved on her, and I failed. I'll admit it.
Whoa.
I did try and her. She was married.
It's huge news there.
No, Nancy,
Yeah.
and I moved on her very heavily. In fact, I took her out furniture shopping. She wanted to get some furniture. I said, I'll show you where they have some nice furniture. I took her out furniture. I moved on her like a but I couldn't get there. And she was married. Then all of a sudden, I see her. She's now got the big phony and everything. She's totally changed her look. I better use some Tic Tacs just in case I start kissing her. You know, I'm automatically attracted to beautiful. I just start kissing them. It's like a magnet. You just kiss. I don't even wait. And when you're a star, they let you do it. You can do anything.
Whatever you want.
Grab them by the. Hello, how are you? Hi.
Trump, how
nice
are
seeing
you?
you.
Pleasure to
Terrific.
meet you.
Terrific. You know Billy Bush?
How are
Nice
you?
to see you. How you doing, Ariane?
I'm doing very well, thank you. Are you ready to be a soap star?
We're ready. Let's go. Make me a soap star.
How about a little hug for the Donnelly? Just go.
That was a replay of that video that is now making the rounds pretty much everywhere. The hot mic moment of Donald Trump in 2005, released by the Washington Post. Hillary Clinton's campaign has taken to Twitter to respond, calling the video horrific and saying, quote, "We cannot allow this man to become president." Her running mate, Tim Kaine, told reporters in Las Vegas just now that the video makes him, quote, "sick to my stomach." With us now from Chicago is Hari Sabugan, former spokesman for Barack Obama's 2008 campaign and a former DNC National Press Secretary. And joining us from Washington, D.C. is John Brabender, a longtime Republican strategist who worked as an advisor on Rick Santorum's 2016 presidential campaign and also has been helping out Mike Pence a little bit. John, I want to start with you as the Republican on the panel. My friend Donnie Deutsch.
Appreciate it.
My friend Donnie Deutsch. First of all, I want to note that you look like a bouncer at Studio 54. But beyond that,
Thank you.
I want to ask you, I like bouncers at Studio 54, so that's a compliment. My friend Donnie Deutsch here says that the election is over on the basis of everything that's come before, but with a punctuation mark with this Trump tape. I'd like to hear your argument for why that's not true.
Well, yeah, first of all, I'll say two things about it. One is I've learned in doing this for 30-some years, campaigns, things are never as bad as you think they are, and they're never as good as you think they are. They're very fluid, and we'll see what happens in the next 48 hours. The key is going to be the first thing the press is going to do is go to a bunch of Senate candidates and congressional candidates in tough races and ask them to comment on it. And they're either going to say, look, he apologized, it was a long time ago, it was unfortunate, I don't condone this, but there are bigger issues, or they're going to throw him under the bus, and that's when we're going to determine how this goes.
John, if these are guys who are running for office and they go home to wives and they have daughters, how can they brush it off? There are certain things you just, no matter where your politics are, you just, for both a human moralistic point of view and a self-survival point of view, how does anybody not distance themselves from it? I can't see the plan A versus the plan B.
Well, first of all, that is entirely true. I can't say it strong enough terms that this was inappropriate. I think it's surprising, maybe a little bit less surprising that Donald Trump said it. In fact, maybe the most surprising thing was he said that he tried something and failed in it. But, you know, the truth of the matter is Hillary Clinton has said a lot of things that are strange. Bill Clinton has said a lot of things that are strange. What has become sort of the norm is this type of bizarre behavior, and people have more of a comfort level for this than they have in the past. Yeah. But I want to say this again. We will know in the next 48 hours whether this is going to be one of those things that just is the final straw, or if people come to expect this just like they did when he went after John McCain with language and all those type of things.
John, I think the issue here is that those things do not qualify as strange comments on Donald Trump's part, and that's not how a lot of voters are going to see them. I want to ask Hari, though, just from a standpoint of tactics and strategy, you're not working at the Clinton campaign, but you've worked on some presidential campaigns. If you were, what's the right way for them to handle this and prosecute it effectively in the days before the debate and then on the debate stage for Hillary Clinton?
Yeah, well, I think the debate is going to be interesting because, you know, the format doesn't really allow for sort of direct interaction. So they're going to have to be very thoughtful, and Hillary's going to have to be thoughtful about how she approaches this. But I think, you know, to the earlier question, this is a devastating comment for Donald Trump because this affects the demographic groups that he needs to move and where he's lost ground. White suburban women. I mean, Mitt Romney won white college-educated women 52-46, and Donald Trump in this latest Monmouth poll is losing them 27-57. The groups that he needs to run up the score with, he's losing really, really badly, and this video goes directly to them.
John, it does seem to me that that is really the heart of the issue here, right? That this is not just, I mean, Trump has said offensive things before. Some of them he's laughed off. Some of them he has escaped with very little price. Some he's paid a price for. But at this stage of the election, the available votes he needs are those votes, right?
Yeah, and it's interesting. I work a lot in Pennsylvania, and I can tell you where he's still struggling a little bit are moderate, white, college-educated women in the southeast, the collar counties of Philadelphia. This certainly is not going to help with that demographic, especially coming off Mike Pence's very positive debate performance, and some editorials saying, too bad Mike Pence isn't at the top of the ticket. I think they had a little bit of momentum starting to come back, and this obviously derails that.
Let's go back to the Democrat. I've got a thesis that there's 3 or 4 more of these to come. This is a behavior pattern over 30 or 40 years. Obviously, you have no knowledge of this, but just as somebody who's kind of been in this business, it's a pretty good guess to think that we're going to see more of these, right?
Yeah. Well, first, I appreciate John working for Mike Pence 2020 there. But I'll also say this. There might be other comments. I mean, we're at a saturation point with Donald Trump and sort of his comments. I think what really is going to happen here is feelings are going to start to harden, right? We're going to see this with women, suburban women. There was a Franklin and Marshall poll, to John's point about Pennsylvania, over the summer where he was already down 30 in those southeast counties, primarily because of women. We're also going to see with independents. He was doing well with independents earlier in the summer. There's a CNN poll out just this week, post-debate, that is a 21-point swing in favor of Hillary Clinton. Donald Trump was winning by 7 points with independents before. I'm sorry, it was a Quinnipiac poll. He's now losing by 14 points. And again, this video is going to go straight to that independent vote.
Right. Harsh Voogan, John Brabender, I believe this is the first time both of you have been on the show, and if that's true, we need to have you back on soon again because you're both great. When we come back,
all over now.
Donnie's singing. When we come back, we're going to talk a little bit more about this hot mic video and the upcoming debates. And if you happen to be watching us in Washington, D.C., you can also listen to us on the radio at Bloomberg 99.1 FM. We'll be right back.
Welcome back. Before we get to reporters, John, you've been in this business a long time. Can you think of any event 4 to 5 weeks out or even in a campaign that could be as devastating as this?
Well, look, one of the key elements of this thing is the audio, obviously, and the video, right? It's, you know, there are a million things that candidates and campaigns can say. If they're not captured on audio and video, they have no life because people read them on the page, but they don't get on television. These are what we call sound. It's this element. So the 47% video was really a tough thing for Romney. Did it change the outcome of the election? No. Did it set them back at a really important time? And again, like this Trump thing, it reinforced a lot of people's views about what Romney thought. They played to an existing narrative of Romney as a really rich guy, unfeeling, didn't care about at least half the country. The combination of something that reinforces an existing narrative and is captured on audio or video is a thing that makes for an explosive, potentially devastating, potentially cataclysmic campaign moment. And this has all of those characteristics. Plus, it's so much like everybody who kind of imagines in their mind what's Trump like in private. That's what people are kind of either believe or suspect or fear Trump is like in private.
There's a difference between being a player versus a misogynist. And some of those words, I'm going to grab her, you know, and use a very, very lewd word and the B word. And it's interesting when you talk about race, when you talk about disabled people, when you talk about women, there seems to be such hatred and disdain for other human beings other than himself. And it's so apparent, and that's an ugliness that I just don't think any educated voter can vote for as a human being.
Yeah, and I think, again, it's, you know, I've said before in the time when the Alicia Machado controversy was playing out right after the first debate, that Trump has gotten in the most trouble when he's been talking about or attacking private citizens. We have a huge tolerance for politicians saying the most vicious things about each other. No one cares. But when you talk about Judge Curiel or the Khan family or Alicia Machado or this unnamed woman who he's talking about putting the moves on and being rebuffed, she's not named here, but it's, again, some person. You know, and it's showing a kind of, this is what, and again, there's something about the hot mic element this is even worse, because there's an element of like, this is the secret true, when Trump doesn't think the cameras are on, this is the way he's talking. And he dismisses it and says, well, it's locker room talk. And you're like, you know what? For a lot of people, the locker room talk reflects the truer self. And when we hear the locker room talk, we say to ourselves, oy vey, that's like the locker room talk? That's going to be the Oval Office talk if he becomes president of the United States.
Okay, we're now joined by Washington Post reporter Jenna Johnson. Jenna, what are you working on today?
Well, right.
What were you working on? It was about voter access, but did that story get crunched up and thrown in the pail?
No, actually, my editor just picked it up, so it'll hopefully be online at some point, and I'm sure everyone will jump to read it. It's still a very important issue.
Does it have any hot mic moments involved? Is there any Trump on the hot mic talking about these issues? If not, I think you're in trouble.
No hot mic issues. I mean,
Jenna, speaking of voter access, to Trump's point this morning, it is true that illegal immigrants can come in the country and vote the next day, correct? That's Trump's thesis.
No, that's
not true. That's amazing. John, I told you that wasn't true.
Yeah, Donnie's very good about these things. Yamishi's on here. That's fancy. Yamishi Alcindor from the New York Times is up. So now we have both of you here. Thank you for both being on the show. I want to ask you both just for a quick reaction one of you covers Donald Trump regularly, one of you does not, but I want to just get your sense. This video is now out. It seems like a kind of seismic moment, the campaign. Jenna, what do you think the Trump campaign's reaction is going to be? And Yamishi, when I get to you after Jenna speaks, you can tell me what you think the broader impact of this is going to be on the campaign dynamics going into the second debate. So first, Jenna.
Well, the campaign very quickly reacted to this and acknowledged that this was a conversation that he did have. They brushed it off as being locker room banter, and he sort of apologized for it, saying that he apologized if anyone was offended by it. But there are already a lot of people on Twitter saying he should denounce these comments. He should say that he should have not said these things about women.
Jenna, before we get off you, I just want to ask you, as a woman, take your reporter hat off. As a woman, can you excuse that and say, well, guys, talk? How did I don't know if you're a mom or if you're a daughter, or just as a woman, what was your reaction? Take your reporter hat off.
Well, I read the transcript earlier today when we first got it and thought, wow, this is very offensive. I then watched the video, and hearing it and hearing the tone in which it's said is different than just reading it. And I think that there are going to be a lot of women across the country who are going to hear these things and are going to be very offended by it. Again, a lot of Donald Trump's core supporters say he could do anything and they're not going to stop supporting him. Those aren't the people that he needs to win over. You know, he's behind Hillary Clinton right now. He needs people beyond just his core group of supporters. And if there were people who were kind of on the fence about things, especially women, especially college-educated women, I think that they might have a hard time voting for someone who says things like this behind the bus door.
Yamish, first thoughts on this, on the impact of this tape?
My first thoughts are, they kind of in some ways echo what Jenna said. This idea is that he's not going to lose, I think, any supporters that are his core supporters because of this. If you can battle with a beauty queen and say that you've called her Miss Piggy and say that you've called her Miss Housekeeper and not lose your core support, then that already tells you kind of what candidate he is. I think that the issue is whether or not he's obviously going to be able to get other people to get on board with him. And to me, it's some ways it's tough because I think there's this idea that he's putting out there, and I think in some ways it's sticking making, that you should not trust the media, that the media is out to get him, that this idea that now the Washington Post is uncovering this audio of him talking like this, and he's saying, you know, I was a private citizen, this is a locker room talk. So the idea is, yes, there are definitely some people that are going to be turned off by this, those suburban voters that he really wants, those women voters that he really wants. But I should tell you, I've talked with a lot of undecided voters. I watched the first debate with undecided voters who were at a Republican party, and there were young women there who said, even with the beauty queen comments, they didn't really see that was going to be something that would make them not vote for him. So to me, that left me thinking he's in some ways a Teflon candidate, but whether or not that's going to go forward, if he can continue to have this, because if I could add, this day was also about the fact that he started off saying that people were coming here illegally to vote. Then he started saying that the Central Park Five men who have definitely been exonerated, who have settled with the city and for being forced to give false confessions. He said that they were guilty, and then now you have this audio. So that's three things just in one day.
Right. Let me just follow up on that for 1 second. If you think about those three things, right? One of them is, in the view of many, a racial dog whistle, the Central Park 5 case. The people come across the border as immigrants illegal immigrants who are going to vote for Hillary Clinton is obviously has Latino implications for that vote. And this is obviously a thing that has implications, this video, for women. Those are three groups that comprise a large part of the American electorate, and we know that Donald Trump has a base. But offending those three voter segments all in one day, 48 hours before the second debate, it would seem to be a problem in terms of what he needs to do to get above his current ceiling, which is about 42% of the electorate. No?
I think that that's definitely problematic. I've been reaching out as soon as this latest audio revealed. I've been reaching out to some Republicans that I know, and so far I've heard radio silence, because I think they are wondering, and I think a lot of the people, the establishment Republicans, are wondering, how is he going to now turn this corner and go into this debate? Because Hillary Clinton has already reacting, set her campaign, sending out statements about the Central Park 5. She's tweeting about this new audio. So I think there's all those things going on. But I should add that I've been talking to pollsters about this race and about who he's offending. And the pollsters tell me that we shouldn't segment the population and think, when he says it says that illegal immigrants are going to come here and vote, and he talks about the Central Park 5 case, that's only hitting one group or a second group. They're telling me that when he goes after Mexicans, saying that they're rapists and criminals, and when he goes after African Americans and calls someone my African American, that suburban white women, college-educated white people in this country are looking at that and saying, I'm offended.
We got to go. And by the way, the tape just takes us to a whole other level, kids. Jenna Johnson, Yamiche Alcindor, thank you. Coming up, some spoilers right after this.
For the past 4 weeks, two of our Bloomberg Politics reporters, two of the most intrepid among our reporters, have been crunching the numbers, driving the battle to win in the battleground states across this great country of ours. This week, they have focused on the impact of third-party candidates in the race. Joining us now, the two men behind the Battleground 2016 series, Steve Yassino, here on our set, and in Columbus, Ohio, we have Sasha Victory Lab Eisenberg. Thank you guys for coming in. Steve, I have a question for you. So, what makes the threat of these third-party spoilers different this year?
The unpopularity of Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton. We saw it today with Donald Trump. Hillary Clinton hasn't necessarily wowed her coalition either, and both of them are flirting with unapproval ratings nearing 60%. And because of that, there's a lot of voters who are looking for other options, and third-party candidates are the natural place to go. Either that or they stay home.
And to be clear, although we have not mentioned them, they are Gary Johnson, the Libertarian candidate,
yep,
and Jill Stein, the Green Party candidate, now both kind of combined hovering at about 10% in the polls.
That's right.
Hey, Sasha, if I'm Clinton, who should I be worried about as far as the vulnerable voters defecting to a third party?
The thing that Clinton's voters that she has to worry about are ones who are not necessarily regular voters. You know, the younger whites that we talk about, the millennials, the Sanders voters, these would be people that she would see as get out the vote targets. They don't have a history of voting. I think that's a little bit of a difference from what Trump sees, where the types of people whom he could lose to a third-party candidate, especially Johnson, would be older white voters who are regular voters and are sort of core part of the Republican base.
So, Steve, other than swing states, where else should Hillary be concerned, and when would they start to panic as far as when they see a move to a third party?
I think there was this assumption early on in the race that Donald Trump was going to be the most affected by third-party candidates, especially because the best one in the race that seemed to be Libertarian Gary Johnson, who's a former Republican governor. And yet we've seen Hillary Clinton lose voters in a lot of key states to the people that Sasha was just mentioning, these young voters, a lot of them, some of them are suburban voters. And so that's a big deal in swing states because any movement in swing states matters. But it matters in other states too, and we looked at a few of them in Pennsylvania, in Virginia, in Colorado, and New Mexico, which is Gary Johnson's home state. These are all states that should lean Democrat, but in those states, if the third-party votes are coming mostly out of Hillary Clinton's column, there could be concern if it gets above 13%, 15% in Virginia, 16% in Colorado, and upwards. That's when they need to start worrying about it.
Sasha, talk about the opposite side of that coin, which is to say red states or pink states, for sure, that Donald Trump has to worry about the third-party thing.
Yeah, you know, so we went through and looked at the opposite thing, which is what if the surge was coming out of Trump's coalition in states where the Democrats weren't actively competing? But you start to see the same thing, which is that in some of these states, if you get between 15 and 20%, Johnson probably more than Stein pulling out of Trump's coalition, these states can be put in play without Hillary Clinton necessarily spending a dime or campaigning there. That, you know, if she just turns out the sort of core Democratic base, that could be a win number in states where the third party is drawing unevenly from the Republican.
Real quick, Sasha, I'm going to ask Steve the same question. Just like in the end, right here, you know, Gary Johnson hasn't made the first debate. He's unlikely to make any of the debates. He's made a bunch of mistakes. Is Johnson going to matter or not, you think, on Election Day? Or are those millennial votes mostly going to either stay home and end up with Hillary Clinton? Which of those do you think is true?
I mean, it doesn't seem like Johnson's doing himself any favors, and it's, you know, arguably the one thing he's done right is not to define himself that clearly. Right. I think it's very hard to understand what Johnson's running on, and that still leaves it possible that he can pull from both sides. You know, we thought that the Libertarian would be pulling from the Republican. The fact is, disaffected Democrats are saying just as much that they like there.
All right, Sasha P. Eisenberg, Stephen. Mr. Television Yassino, fantastic. Thank you both. You can check out their Battleground 2016 series on BloombergPolitics.com, and they'll be back next week at the next installment. I can't wait to see it, and we'll be right back. On Sunday, I will not be with Donny Deutsch, although I love being with Donny Deutsch, and it was great to spend Friday with him. Instead, I will be with my normal partner, Mark Halpern, and we'll be hosting a pregame show live from St. Louis, where the second debate is happening. Please watch that. You can watch it on not just on Bloomberg Television, but also on Twitter, following our handle at BloombergPolitics.com and go to debates.twitter.com. From Donny and I, we say to you, sayonara.